U.S. presidential debate. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris best and worst moments. The presidential debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump in Philadelphia showcased both their strengths and weaknesses. While Harris appeared composed and on point during most exchanges, Trump had a rougher night with some statements that drew skepticism. Hosted by ABC News, the debate was fact-checked more rigorously than previous ones, adding to Trump's challenge. Even though Harris seemed to dominate, each candidate had their standout moments, both good and Kamala Harris's weaknesses. Despite her strong showing, Harris faced difficult moments when pressed on her policy changes, particularly regarding fracking. She struggled to justify the shifts in her positions, which included abandoning her earlier stance on banning fracking. Harris also struggled with the topic of Gaza, taking a middle-of-the-road approach that might not satisfy any side, raising questions about how different her policies would be from the current administration, if ever. Donald Trump's weaknesses. One of Trump's most striking missteps came when he repeated unverified claims about immigrants harming domestic animals, which ABC News debunked immediately. He also faced backlash for reviving a past comment about Harris's racial identity, a controversy he hasn't been able to shake. Lastly, Trump struggled when questioned about healthcare. When asked why he hadn't presented a plan to replace the Affordable Care Act, his vague response about having concepts. What were Kamala Harris's key strengths during the Philadelphia debate? Kamala Harris's strengths included her focus on reproductive rights and tying Trump to restrictive abortion laws. She also addressed the Capitol riot, framing Trump as insecure and criticizing his self-interest in economic and what were Donald Trump's strengths during the debate? Trump's strengths involved discussing inflation and the economy, connecting with voters frustrated by high prices. He also criticized U.S. financial support for Ukraine, appealing to those who believe domestic issues need more attention. In their campaigns, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris project different emotions and moods. The contrast between them was particularly sharp during their debate on September 10, 2024. One candidate made appeals to the past, used more negative words and invoked fear. The other spoke more of the future, used more positive words and appealed to voters' sense of hope. As a linguist, writer, and professor who teaches mostly sociolinguistics, how language operates in society, I have always been fascinated by the ways in which people tend to use language and patterns. The recent Harris-Trump debate offered me an opportunity to examine how these candidates were using language to win over voters. Looking at which approach a candidate chooses can reveal deeper truths about them. Traditionally, according to the study of rhetoric and language, politicians can appeal to reason, emotion, or authority, or some combination of them, to persuade their audiences. In terms of emotion, both fear and hope can be effective at motivating voters. There's not a right or wrong way to do it. Linguists have developed the concept of the idiolect, an individual dialect that is like a fingerprint, different for each individual and made out of our unique linguistic and social experiences. People often prepare and rehearse for public speaking events, but once they are actually facing an audience, they tend to revert to what is intuitive and already second nature to them, their idiolect. A speaker is not thinking about how long their sentences are, for example. They are thinking about the ideas they want to express. They might not realize that there are patterns to their speech and delivery, or that they return to the same words again and again. Negativity. I prompted an artificial intelligence tool to answer questions about frequency of words, lengths of sentences, and kind of words in the debate. I checked all of the output of the AI tool manually, so I could make sure there were no discrepancies. Here's what I was looking for. I anticipated that the candidates' use of language in the debate would reflect their differing approaches to campaigning, particularly in terms of past or present orientation, appeals to fear or hope, and negative or positive statements. First, I selected 6 segments of the debate transcript, each of equivalent lengths and each featuring both candidates responding to the same question, or at least a similar one. Then I looked at negativity in their language. I expected that more negative statements would more closely align with appeals to the politics of fear, while more positive ones would relate more closely to the politics of hope. If a candidate is appealing to fear, they will likely focus on things that may or have gone wrong. By contrast, if they focus on hope, they are likely to focus on what might go right in the future. I found that Trump consistently made more negative statements than Harris. That was true of each of the 6 segments individually, with rates varying from 33% more to 166% more. For example, in a 30-second segment, Trump used negative statements and words such as totally destroy and disaster 12 times. In her 30-second response, Harris used negative statements or words only 7 times. The tenor of the terms was also different. Trump's negative words tended to be stronger, such as violently, very horribly, and ridiculous. Overall, for all the segments I analyzed, Trump made on average about 61% more negative statements than Harris. Shorter sentences? Then I looked at sentence length. I thought shorter sentences might tend to communicate a sense of urgency that would align more closely with fear, and that longer ones could be more fluid and calmer, and therefore more associated with hope. I looked at 3 segments from the original set of 6. Intuitively, people might think that short statements are a reflection of directness and addressing issues head-on, but that is not necessarily the case. For example, one of Trump's relatively short statements, the agreement said you have to do this, 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 and they didn't do it, can be considered evasive because it does not contain the level of specificity that would allow a listener to make their own assessment of whether something has been accomplished or not. And yet, it is simple and short, made a bit longer only by the repetition of this. For the first segment I analyzed, the average length of sentences for Trump was 13 words, while for Harris it was 17 words. The gap widened for the second segment, in which the average length of sentences for Trump was 14 words, while for Harris it was 25 words. That pattern was the same in the third segment as well. Talk of the future. Finally, I looked at how they talked about the future and the past, and whether they talked about one or the other more, as possible indicators of greater reliance on fear and on hope. Usually in the context of fear, the recent past is used as a time to escape from, while the more distant past is a time to return to. By contrast, people who focus on hope look to the future. When I analyzed their concluding remarks, I found that both candidates made the same number of references to the past, but in very different ways. Most of Harris' references to the past were about the fact that Trump often focuses on it. For example, she said there is an attempt to take us backward, and continued, "We're not going back." Trump, on the other hand, spoke more about the perceived failures of his opponents in the past, such as, "They've had 3.5 years to fix the border." He also talked about what he perceives to be his past achievements, such as, "I rebuilt our entire military." In terms of future statements, all 4 of Trump's were about what he says will happen if his opponent wins. For example, if she won the election, fracking in Pennsylvania will end on day 1. Harris had 9 future statements, all of which were about what she intends to do. For example, she said, "And when I am president, we will do that for all people. Understanding that the value I bring to this is that access to health care should be a right and not just a privilege of those who can afford it." Also in her closing statement, Harris summed up both the debate and the findings of my research. Kamala Harris cuts Donald Trump's advantage on the economy in half. Pointing the economy is a major issue among voters and has been a huge talking point since the start of the election cycle, when Trump, the GOP presidential nominee, was up against President Joe Biden. When Biden exited the race in July, he endorsed Harris and she eventually won the Democratic Party's nomination. While Harris still has a way to go in convincing voters that she is better for the economy, she has so far fared better than Biden on the subject. In a national poll conducted by NBC News from September 13th to 17th, Trump was ahead of Harris on issues of the economy by 9 points, 50 to 41%. While this is a blow to Harris, who made it a point to talk about her economic policies on the debate stage in Philadelphia earlier this month, she has improved the perception of how Democrats would handle the economy if they continued to run the White House. When NBC News asked voters whether Trump or Biden would be better at handling the economy in January, Trump was ahead of Biden by 22 points. Sunday's NBC News poll surveyed 1,000 registered voters and has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.1 percentage points. The NBC News poll from January 26 to 30th had a sampling size of 1,000 registered voters and a margin of error of 3.1 percentage points. Newsweek reached out to Harris's and Trump's campaigns via email for comment on Sunday mid-morning. In a CBS News Charts YouGov poll taken between September 18th to 20th, 27% of respondents think the economy is getting better, while 48% think it's getting worse. 25% think the economy is about the same. One good sign for the economy is the Federal Reserve cutting its benchmark rate, known as the federal funds rate, this week by a large half point. The Fed raised the rate 11 times in 2022 and 2023 to curb high inflation, which hit both the United States and countries around the world after the COVID-19 pandemic. The rate cut is the first in over 4 years. The cost of consumer borrowing, including for mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards, should go down over time with a series of Fed cuts. Meanwhile, 88% of respondents in the CBS News YouGov poll say the economy is a major factor in their vote for president, compared to 11% who say it's a minor factor. Just 1% said it's not a factor. The poll surveyed 3,129 registered voters nationwide and had a margin of error of plus or minus 2.2 percentage points. Trump also leads Harris by 21 points on securing the U.S.-Mexico border and controlling immigration, 8 points on dealing with inflation and the cost of living, and 6 points on dealing with crime and violence, Sunday's NBC News poll found. Meanwhile, Harris has a 28-point lead over Trump on protecting immigrant rights, a 21-point lead on abortion rights, a 20-point lead on having the necessary mental and physical health to be president, a 16-point lead on having the right temperament to be president, a 15-point lead on being honest and trustworthy, and a 9-point lead on representing change. Harris gets good news from economists. Nearly 40 economists recently said that Harris's economic agenda would be better for the economy. In a survey published last week by the Financial Times and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, Kent A. Clark Center for Global Markets, 70% of the economists said Trump's economic policies would be more inflationary, meaning they would be more likely to cause inflation. Only 3% said Harris's economic policies would be inflationary. Meanwhile, 27% said there is no material difference in each economic platform's inflationary consequences. A total of 70% also thought Trump's economic platform would produce larger federal budget deficits, while only 11% said Harris's platform would, and 19% said there would be no material difference. Budget deficits are when government expenses exceed revenue. They also add to the national debt, which is not good for the economy. What are Harris's and Trump's economic policies? Harris wants to expand tax deductions for small businesses, restore and increase the child tax credit, and lower housing costs by giving first-time homeowners down payment assistance. The vice president plans to pay for these social benefits by raising taxes on the wealthy and big corporations. She also wants to crack down on price gouging to help with Americans' grocery bills. Trump, meanwhile, plans to continue the tax cuts he passed in 2017, which largely benefited the rich and big businesses. He also proposed 10 to 20% tariffs on all imports and a 60% tariff on imports from China. The former president has also promoted deregulation.